as in John Calvin, was wrong when he accused the Holy Roman Catholic Church and the uninterrupted succession of popes or bishops of Rome as never having been truly called for or planned for or brought into existence by the wishes of our Lord Jesus Christ himself, and that therefore that was part of the Holy Roman Church that no one had to obey, no one had to acknowledge. And they offered up treatises to this effect, and those treatises were answered by the Holy Roman Church after a series, or during, while simultaneously a series of councils was going on, and they were answered by one man, and his name was just Robert Bellarmine at the time. Of course, he is today Saint Robert Bellarmine, and he wrote several volumes on this. The one that we are currently discussing now is Volume 1, Books 1 and 2, and that's on the controversy on the Roman Pontiff. And we pick up where we left off last week with our Latinist expert, Ryan Grant. Ryan, who is the publisher of Mediatrix Press. Let me spell that for you. That's MEDIATRIXPRESS, mediatrixpress.com. Christopher, I got a feedback. Can you turn that Skype feed down, because it's rolling right back through? Thank you. And Ryan published this book and also Volume 3 of this work. And as always, Ryan, welcome to the Modern Wrong World Made Right.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And we are in Volume 2 now, Chapter 13. Dude, feedback. I can hear it. Feedback.
Sorry, I'm not sure if that's in my...
No, it's on us.
Okay.
We're on chapter...
Well, actually, before we started today,
Yes.
I wanted to mention that this Friday in the 1962 calendar is the traditional Latin, the traditional calendar of the Church that's used in the traditional Latin Mass. It's actually St. Robert Bellarmine's feast day.
Yeah, Ryan, I'm sorry. I was working out the technical difficulty. Please proceed.
Okay. Well, on this Friday in the traditional calendar, the 1962 calendar, it's going to be St. Robert Bellarmine's feast day. And just so everyone knows that, you go to Mass. And also, probably next week, I'm actually releasing another translation, which we haven't got through all this, but it's going to be on the Church Militant, which is a book Bellarmine wrote basically defining the Church against ancient and modern, his time modern heresies, which are the first Protestants mostly. So he addresses all the questions there: who's in the Church, who's not in the Church, what is the Church, and then is the Church a visible Church against the error of Calvin.
And of course, the Church is the mystical body, the Church Militant is the mystical body of Christ, right? Is that how he defines it?
Well, yes. Well, I mean, it's a term that comes from St. Paul, but essentially,
right.
So how do we, is it something that's visible? Do we see it? See, because there's the error of the early Protestants, especially Luther and Calvin, that it's not visible. It's just in the hearts of men. It's just it's built on faith, so that therefore you don't have a hierarchical, visible body, right? But then they found problems with that, so they had imposed their own hierarchies. But that's not what made the Church. It was the faith of individual men. You see. So that's how they approached it, and that's been a constant thing, is the visibility of the Church, and the fact that, and that's why you have the four marks, right? One, Holy, Catholic, and Apostolic. It's something visible you can see all throughout the world. These particular notes or marks.
And chapter 13, where we pick up at in volume 2 of the De Romano Pontifice. Book 2, Chapter 13, that the Roman Pontiff succeeds Peter in the ecclesiastical monarchy is proven from the councils. Now, when you say councils, that means this council that's going on right now is the Council of Trent, and that's where Bellarmine is involved now, right?
Well, not quite. Well, Trent was done already at the time he writes these works.
Okay.
Very narrowly, actually. a history in the Council of Trent would probably be a fabulous historical podcast.
Or
But in the
wouldn't it?
meantime, that closes in 1565. He writes, he starts teaching these classes in the Roman College in the 1570s, and this work is published in the 1580s. So by this time, it's already been concluded, and in 30 years it had been implemented, throughout, gradually. In some places it wasn't all the way implemented, like in France, where they didn't want to put it in. So actually what the council is dealing with, eventually we get to it, but he's really looking at arguments that the early Protestants bring against, especially Luther and Calvin and Illyricus, against the church based on the early councils, so based on Nicaea, because the Protestants didn't reject all the councils, so they accepted Nicaea. Largely they picked and choose. And Bellarmine will say this in his work on councils, that what the Protestants do is they beg, they clamor for a council in order to be heard, and then the church calls a council. Right, Charles V and Paul III, agree to have a council in German territory, which is why it's in Trent, because at the time Trent was in German territory versus states in northern Italy, and so that's why they agreed to do it. And then the Lutherans all back out. No, never mind. We don't really want a council. And eventually, some Lutherans did come to Trent, and some were allowed to address the council. But nevertheless, it wasn't to their liking. They wanted it all in their particular terms. Melanchthon wrote that, nobody should be condemned, in which place Bellarmine stops and says, well, what's the point of a council? That's what councils have always done. So they do accept the early councils, especially at least up to Chalcedon. The Council of Chalcedon, which declared that Christ is one divine person, but with two natures, one human and one divine.
Okay.
And and of course Nicaea. So they look at in every council, as everyone knows, like the specific teaching of these early councils. Well, they used to, they should.
Right.
But nevertheless, they also, what a lot of people are less familiar with, is that these councils also gave canons. That means they rule, hence we get the term canon law, because it's a Greek term. And so what a canon meant in the early church is a little bit different than how we take it today. So canons at councils sometimes were doctrinal, and sometimes merely legislative and punitive. So it might not have anything it might just be different business. Okay, let it be this way. Let these laws go in this sort of fashion. So Calvin and Luther and Illyricus, they look at the Council of Nicaea and they start pulling out some canons, and the same for the other canons, the other councils. Sorry. So what they do is with the Council of Nicaea, which was against Arius, which defined that Christ really was a divine person. He was not a man, not just a good man, but he really was the Son of God. He really was homoousion, right, which is the Greek term, consubstantial with the Father. It's why we see that in the Creed every Sunday. Incidentally, too, we're talking about this in the Byzantine Rite, in the Eastern Catholic Church. Last Sunday was the celebration of the Council of Nicaea. So that feast just occurred in their calendar. But so they also had various canons, and so the Protestants take then canon 6, and this is where we start here in chapter 13.
Okay.
And they say, let me summarize it, is that it only says the Pope is one of patriarchs, and it assigns him a territory that's far less than the territory of the other patriarchs. And so they use this to argue against the primacy of the Roman Pontiff, and that there is a papal monarchy that Peter's succeeding to. And so basically they say that this canon of Nicaea, the Sixth Council, says, let the most ancient custom endure in Egypt or Libya, in Pentapolis, that the Bishop of Alexandria should have power over all these, because at least the Bishop of Rome has a similar custom. So that's the quote from the canon. So then they use that to argue that therefore the Pope is they're assigning him territory, so the council's above the Pope, and he doesn't really have this authority and whatnot.
Okay.
So that's what they argue. Now that we come down to Bellarmine, first he says we've got to note some things, where he says that Pope Nicholas I references this, and he says that it stated nothing about the Roman Church because its power is not from men but from God. Rather, it only constituted the state of other churches according to the form of the Roman Church. And that's what Pope Nicholas I says. So therefore, the council doesn't say, let the Bishop of Rome have administration of this or that region, but it says, let the Bishop of Alexandria have care of Egypt and Libya because the Bishop of Rome is so accustomed. So obviously, the Roman Church should be the rule of others, and nothing is stated about her properly. Therefore, Calvin, Illyricus, Nihilus, and the rest err when they say that there are certain boundaries assigned to the Bishop of Rome. That, without a doubt, he should only have care of suburban churches and, like the things they argue there. And so he, then there's some other things noted on that. And then we come to what today is actually the Greek Orthodox position. So he says the second explanation is from Theodore Balsamon, who's a 13th century Greek Orthodox canonist. In his explanation of these canons, as well as Nihilus in his book, which he's been quoting all throughout.
Okay.
Right? So now this is the Greek Orthodox position. So he says that the, let's see. Sorry, I lost my place. So there we go. So they argue that when the council says, because the Bishop of Rome has such a custom, is that it gives the reasoning why a custom ought to be remaining in Egypt. Okay, and so that it basically it's limiting the Pope. So he says, that the Bishop of Rome has care of the West is not, that basically it only means the Bishop of Rome has care of the West and the others have care of the East, right? And so then he goes on to other things. So then he gets to the sum of this particular argument. Going through different things. Let's see. I lost my place here again. Sorry. Because I was reading through the Latin there. Okay. So after going through all these, he says, none of these are solid explanations, and there's no better copies extant of the Council of Nicaea than those possessed by the ancient Roman pontiffs, as we'll show below when we treat on the question of titles. So the copies were in Greek, and they were thoroughly burnt by the Arians, as St. Athanasius witnesses in his epistles to all the Orthodox bishops, and therefore little wonder if those which are cited by the Greeks are somewhat corrupted. Next, those contained in the Roman Church are the ones which the Bishop Pascasanius brought as a legate to the Council of Chalcedon on behalf of Pope St. Leo, where this canon was read in a council. And likewise we read there, because the Bishop of Rome has such a custom. Add that it's not good reasoning why the Bishop of Alexandria ought to have such power that the metropolitans had a custom. For metropolitans don't rule, right, more than one province, and Alexandria had many provinces. So then there's another explanation of these words. So where they say that it's true that Alexandria ought to govern those provinces because the Bishop of Rome was so accustomed. What that means, because the Bishop of Rome customarily permitted the Bishop of Alexandria to rule Egypt, Pentapolis, etc., before the definition of the council, or was his custom to govern those provinces through a Bishop of Alexandria. So Nicholas I understood this, right? And that's basically the position that Bellarmine's propounding here to explain these words. So it's not that the council's limiting it. The council's rather acknowledging what had always been the case.
Right, so this is the fourth explanation.
Right.
What she says is the true one, that Alexandria, just folks, if you're following along at home, just to drive the point home, then the fourth explanation is the true one, that Alexandria ought to govern those provinces because the Bishop of Rome was so accustomed. That is, because the Bishop of Rome customarily permitted the Bishop of Alexandria to rule Egypt, Libya, and Pentapolis before the definition of any council, or it was his custom to govern those provinces through the Bishop of Alexandria. Nicholas I understood this canon in that way in his epistle to the Emperor Michael, nor does any other probable explanation appear. In other words, this is just another straw dog, another straw man has been thrown up to try and repudiate the primacy of the Roman Pontiff by lack of positive evidence that says, well, they declared that this, but in the way that Bellarmine looks at this, and I think this is the correct way, well, they didn't have to declare it because it was not necessary to declare it. The custom already was there. See, this is the thing, Ryan, and I run into this all the time with my our friends and listeners, Protestant friends and listeners here. Not everything was written down. You live in an age when a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen and a piece of paper or a digital or an iPad or a dictation device or something is always at your disposal to write things down. And yes, people do write most things down. They didn't do that because they didn't have the means. So an oral tradition or an actual tradition in practice or custom is just as evidentiary that something was as it being written down. Is that correct?
That is, actually. And you have to remember too the reasoning why the patriarchs have the power that they do, right? Because Bellarmine notes how in the early church these patriarchates are not given in the authority of the apostles. Right? It's not a patriarchate because an apostle died there. It's a patriarchate because it's connected with the apostle Peter. That's why every single patriarchate is present. Alexandria because Peter had sent Mark there. And then Antioch, as Peter had initially been there and confirmed a successor there. And so that's why, and then Jerusalem had a primacy of honor, but not an actual authority. And this will come up again later in the treatise. So that, Constantinople only comes into the mix because of the fact that it was a royal city and the emperor was, trying to control the church, right? In history of the Eastern Roman Empire, they call that Caesaropapism. Because the emperor is always trying to control the church by controlling the patriarch, and he's mad when things don't work out the way he wants, but he doesn't have this. So that's why the Patriarchate of Constantinople is always agitating, even as early as Nicaea, to be made a patriarchate, right? Because they wanted to get in the game, but it wasn't connected to that. So finally, after Chalcedon, it was begrudgingly allowed as a concession to the emperor to have it be considered a patriarchate. So, but the original patriarchates were all based on Peter. Right, and so that's why, it only makes sense, too, that it would be a model for how the other patriarchates should have specific territory.
This is the Modern Wrong World Made Right. This is our ongoing discussion here that Calvin, as in John Calvin, was wrong. Episode number 9 with our Latinist expert, Ryan Grant. You can read Ryan's work in 3 volumes and in other great works at his website, Mediatrix, Mediatrix, press.com. And Ryan, as always, thanks again for being here. The Council of Ephesus, as it is found in Evagrius, says that it deposed Nestorius by a command of a letter of the Roman Pope Celestine. Also in the letter to the same Celestine, the same council writes that it did not dare to judge the case of John, the Patriarch of Antioch, which was more dubious than the case of Nestorius. And of course, Nestorius was the Nestorian heresy, right? Thus, it reserved its judgment for Celestine, all of which especially indicates the supreme authority of the Roman Pontiff. The Council of Chalcedon in Acts 1, 2, and 3, and in numerous other places, calls St. Leo Pontiff of the Universal Church. And in an epistle to Leo, and Ryan, you're the Latinist, epistle, is that Greek or is that Roman or Latin for letter?
It's it's the Latin word for letter, epistula, and it also comes from Greek. And actually, I think that's the origin of the term is the Greek. And so the Latin also has, you can use the word littera, which actually means letter, like letter of the alphabet. And you can put it in plural, and then it means a letter, singular.
Okay.
And so it's, but otherwise, epistula is the normal form. And because that's the term, I guess, in Cicero's, that's the one they generally prefer. So what happens is in the early church, up until I think the First Lateran Council, unless I'm mistaken, the Pope did not come directly to an ecumenical council. It was thought that he should, be an arduous journey. And, one source I read said, well, Leo almost went, but it wasn't the custom. It would, like he thought about it, but it wasn't the custom for the Pope to go directly, but to be there through legates. And that's an interesting thing you see also. Bellarmine doesn't pick this up. 19th century writer that I remember picked this up, but that when you look at the names of those who signed all the decrees of the Council of Nicaea, for example,
okay,
at the top are 2 priests, the papal legates. And the word legatus means like a deputy or ambassador, something of that sort of lieutenant. And so it anglicizes as legate in church history to talk about somebody at the Pope is sent. So these guys who are just priests, their names are at the head of the list above all the other bishops because they're representing the Roman Pontiff. So and that's why the councils send letters, to the Pope and back and forth because of the fact that he's distant, but he's being kept apprised of what's going on at the council, so he's aware of what's going on. Therefore, when all the documents come for his approval, he's already got a good idea of where everything's gone as he's approving things. So constantly, the Pope would write letters to the council, basically giving kind of like a preliminary text, even of sorts, that we should be talking about this. Now, of course, Ephesus was called to deal with the heresy of Nestorius, which was that Christ, that Mary only gave birth to a nature that he would basically argue we shouldn't be using this term Theotokos, which is a Greek term applied to the Virgin Mary.
Right.
That is mother, it basically means mother of God when you get down to it. She gives birth to Christ. And he said, sorry, not to Christ, but to God. Nestorius said, no, we can't say that. A creature can't give birth to its creator, which in the normal order would be true, but because it's a miracle, right? It's something that God is doing. Well, so therefore, he said, Nestorius says that it has to be Christotokos, that she only gave birth to Christ's human nature, not to his divine nature. Right? And so this is the origin of the problem that then sets up the next council, because then, so he's separating the natures of Christ out and saying Mary only gave birth to one, not the other. And then while he was preaching this in the Cathedral of Constantinople, it was before Justinian built Hagia Sophia, so it wasn't that one. Somebody got up and said, "Oh, so whoever heard of any women giving birth to a nature?" And everybody laughed about it, and then Nestorius got mad, threw him out of the church, and then kept going. So that's how that it kind of blew up in this big crisis. And so the Council of Ephesus was ended when the Roman Pope called a council, and then St. Cyril of Alexandria comes and with his party, and then he persuades those who were hanging on Nestorius' side to come over and accept this particular teaching that Mary is the mother of God, and that was what they proclaimed at the council, because it was so important to protect basically authentic Mariology, real study and real teaching of the Mother of God, protects and preserves authentic Christology, right? Who Christ is. And so that's how, and so the acts of this council show that they see the authority of the Roman Pontiff in this matter, and they accept it. And then Chalcedon's the next council. That gets set up because then there's a monk named Eutychus who doesn't like this language of the nature. And in Greek, the term is physis, right? Nature, so we get the term physical from that. So the physis is the term they use to differentiate what we say in Latin, natura. So that Christ has a human nature and a divine nature, and they're all one person, right? And so you're separating out. I'm sorry, I said that wrong earlier. I got to correct myself. I used the wrong term. I said physis. I meant prosopon. Prosopon means. No, wait, no, I was right the first time. Sorry, I got the Greek jumbled in my head.
I was going to say physis sounds correct.
So physis is right for nature, and then prosopon in Greek it means face, and actually persona in Latin also originally meant face, or it meant like a mask that you would wear in a play. Okay. So persona is likewise for prosopon in Greek. So for some reason I jumbled them up in my head. Yeah, that's right. I had it right first. So prosopon is Christ has one nature, one person. And he has two natures. He's human and divine. So this monk Eutychus didn't like that. So they called a second council to meet at Ephesus to deal with people who weren't, it seemed they might be secretly Nestorian and still hold to this doctrine. And Eutychus propounds this doctrine, and they booted out the papal legates who wouldn't accept them, right? And so the Pope at the time was Pope St. Leo the Great. He condemned this council. He called it a latrocinium, which means robber council. So you'll see the second council of Ephesus is not really a council, right? It was called the robber council of Ephesus because this heretic Eutychus took it over and propounded what we call monophysitism, one in the Greek monos, one nature. Right? And we can't say that he has two different natures because then you're separating out the natures. You have to keep it united in one. We can't talk about the separateness, right? And so that's the doctrine of monophysitism, which you actually still find it's still formally professed by this, for example, the Coptic Orthodox, right? And other groups like that. So that was the issue then. So again, Leo the Great writes to the council. He actually moves for the council to happen. His legates are present, and so they call him Pontiff of the Universal Church.
Ryan, that's a good question. I've been meaning to ask you. When did the term Christian began to be used, you may know this, you may not, exclusively as opposed to the term universal or Catholic?
I'm not certain. Obviously, in the early Reformation is probably when, the reference would be, being Christians versus, being Catholic wasn't really being a Christian. Right. Is for the early Protestants, that would be the issue, is that, the Pope's the Antichrist, and so therefore all these doctrines are evil against the gospel, but they would argue themselves as being Christians. Now, that was only, they would say that, and then on the Catholic side say, no, actually, we're Christians, and you're heretics, so you're not really Christian, and, and that sort of went around, but especially in our English language consciousness, it seems to me it would be in this 18th or the 19th century that happens, where the use of the term, and probably the 19th century, where the use of the term Christian then is applied principally to Protestants and non-denominational churches and those who follow that, and then but there would be an eschewing of the term Catholic. And so then they'll say, oh, well, Catholicos, that only means, that's Greek, it just means universal.
That's right.
It doesn't actually mean, in anything or any specific church. And that's one of the, those issues that it's like an attempted diversion. Right? Well, it doesn't really mean anything. Well, wait a minute. Yes, it does, right? It means universally everywhere, it's like St. Vincent of Lawrence says in the Commonitorium, 5th century, that what has always been believed everywhere and by all, right? And he qualifies all, as in all those who are truly adhere to the Roman Church.
Right, right.
That's in the 5th century. But that's the nature of the thing, right? Where they're very clearly arguing that it's a question of that that universality isn't just the Catholic side argues that the universality as meant by Catholicos isn't just, well, it's not just a name we picked and usurped. That's actually used in the early church, and for a good reason, right? Because then the heretics trying to promote their doctrines would say, would actually call them Catholicoi, you universalists. You think that everyone's got to hold the same thing, right? How dare you? It actually sounds familiar, doesn't it?
It does sound familiar, and it was just something that I was thinking about the other day. And when we finish this controversy, we could cover the if you have any expertise on this. Were there similar councils that were conducted at about the time of the breaking between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Church?
That's actually a more complicated thing. There were councils that happened in that time. The issue is that the history that we've been given is largely false, and it's like a pop history that everyone seems to accept. Even poor Paul VI, who didn't know any better back in the day, like nobody stopped to tell him. By the way, you're trying to get rid of this 1054 excommunication, but well, it's long been known that wasn't valid, and in case of the fact, it was undone formally by Pope Urban II.
That's what I thought.
So why exactly are we once again undoing this excommunication that's already been undone? It's one of those issues where you have this pop history narrative. Oh, in 1054 they excommunicated each other, wouldn't talk to each other, and now they're coming back together again. Well, sorry, it didn't work that way.
Well, I have an EO friend, 2 of them, that tell me that I'm crocked in the head when I say that 1054 is not the day. Yeah, that's because you're not EO. You don't know what you're talking about.
Well, I say, they can look at an Eastern Orthodox author, Nicholas Zernoff, and his History of the Orthodox Church. There's one source to go to. I forget exactly when it was written, but he is a Greek Orthodox author. He's not Catholic, and he notes the fact that this was, this is a phony date and everything. So they can take it up with one of their own guys. I don't know, but the fact is that the issue, Pope Benedict IX was fighting for the Eastern Church, the Eastern Empire in southern Italy against the Normans. The Normans were invading from Sicily. They were also invading the Eastern Empire in Greece itself. And the Pope took up arms and was fighting the Normans in South Italy on behalf of the Roman Empire, that is the Byzantine Empire. And the thanks he got for it was as the Photian controversy comes up again, which had been dealt with at the Eighth Council, which they rejected as a council, by the way, they were Orthodox.
Right.
Then, they started fomenting this and sending letters calling him a heretic. So the only member of Benedict IX's staff that spoke Greek was Cardinal Humbert, who, if I'm not mistaken, was Frank or German. I can't even think he was French, but beside that, at that time, French is more fluid than today. So he got on the boat as a papal legate, went to Constantinople, argued with the Greeks. He was strict with a sore temper, and the diversity of arguments and issues in arguing in Greek just got to him. So finally, they torqued him off enough. He wrote a bull of excommunication in the name of the Pope. At the time, the Pope was dead. The Pope had died in a Norman jail because his assault on the Normans had basically tricked his general into fighting on their ground. I could go into the military history of that, but it would take too much time. So the Normans won. They arrested the Pope. They put him in jail. They adhered him as their father, but he's also a political prince as opposed to them, so they were going to keep him nestled up in prison. So the result was that he wasn't even able to keep up with the events in Constantinople. He died, And then about a month after he died, before any news had gotten to Humbert, his legations basically ended at that point. He issues the bull of excommunication, Hagia Sophia, and walks out. And they said, oh, yeah, well, we excommunicate the Pope, which they can't do anyway, but he's also dead, so it doesn't matter. And then, but anyway, so this issue's there. So once you get to the, you have two things. You have the Battle of Manzikert. Manzikert, I think is how you say it in Turkish, but it's an area over in what's today Far Eastern Turkey. The Eastern Roman Empire was negotiating with the Turks. The Turks wanted a quick negotiation to some peace plan so they could go and attack the heretic Muslims in Egypt, if the Shiites that took over the Egyptian empire, so we call the Fatimids, after Muhammad's daughter Fatima.
Okay.
And so they're Shiites, and the Turks were Sunni. So they wanted to go smash them because they hated them more than they hated the Roman Christians, who were Christian, right? And so it's one of those funny things. So but then the Romans had a superior position and a better army, so they wouldn't do it. So then the Turks started, reeling back, and then at some point some of the mercenaries mutinied against the emperor, and then the Turks attacked, and then he was routed, he was captured and killed. Now, this is often taken in history as this is the moment where the Eastern Empire is in peril, it lost their army. Well, not exactly. That's been an exaggeration for about 100 years, and people in Byzantine studies have showed that the Eastern Empire really just kept going. It wasn't really much of a problem for them. Their problem was the Normans invading Greece. That was their problem, because the Normans had depleted them of their reserves and their troops, and so he appealed to the Pope for help against, for the situation. That's when Benedict IX answered, and then they get the controversy of the excommunication, right? So the sting of the Normans had really hurt them in Greece, but eventually the Normans were beat off, and then you have the Turks invade Anatolia while they're finishing up the Normans in Greece, and this was a big problem for them. So that's when they write to the new Pope, Pope Urban II, saying, "Hey, you know what? So a little help here. We've got we just finished off with the Normans. Now we got the Turks in Nicaea, and they're looking Constantinopleward." And so that's when they have the Great Crusade called and everything, to answer this particular plea for help from Alexei Komnenos, who's the emperor at the time. So Urban II, removed any excommunication or suspension on the Eastern Church, reconciled Alexius Komnenos, and now they're restored to the Catholic Church, and they remain so until the 13th century. And then you have a series of events. First, of course, you have the famous sack of Constantinople by the Crusaders, which we will never be forgiven for by the East, even though it was a mix of things. It was not an initiative of the Pope. It was actually an initiative of the Venetians, who kind of directed that crusade, and then, which is why Innocent III condemned the action when it happened. But nevertheless, they'll never forgive us for that. So that's what created a special Roman hatred amongst, whereas before it was merely a theological squabble nobody cared about.
I did not know
Now,
that.
You have the whole sack of Constantinople by the Crusaders, so now there's the hate's there, amongst everybody. And that sets in the anti-Roman attitude that largely persists to this very day, I might add.
It most certainly
does.
does.
Main things.
Well, I'm not going to get into it because we're going to get off subject here. Let's get back to St. Robert Bellarmine. I want to have you on. I want to do an entire episode or two on this little piece of history because this is fascinating. But let's get back to chapter 16 on the controversy over the Roman Pontiff, that the Roman Pontiff succeeds Peter in the ecclesiastical monarchy is proven from the testimonies of the supreme pontiffs. So I suppose you're going to have to start, you could just read from your work, but supreme pontiffs, those are early pontiffs?
No, it's just another term. I use Roman Pontiff and Supreme Pontiff largely interchangeably. They're largely interchangeable, but there's just a different distinction of the same thing. So and they're largely interchangeable in this work. So it just depends, because sometimes he uses the word Supreme Pontiff, and I've left it as Supreme Pontiff. Sometimes he uses it, and depending on the context, I make it Roman Pontiff, just if the context fits it better in English. But so the Supreme Pontiff, it means the same thing. The Roman Pontiff is the Supreme Pontiff. And so here, then the next argument's chapter 14 on this question. So it kind of leaves off what I mentioned with text criticism. Were these things fraudulent? Luigi Valla in his declamation against the false donation of Constantine and things like that. So all this text criticism comes around. And so the Protestants have a hyper text criticism against against things that, these things are fraudulent, all these guys are flatters of the curious, or they made this stuff up and things like that. So Bellarmine starts up to deal with this question. And so he says that he divides everything into three classes. So the first class, he says, contains epistles of the popes, that is the pontiffs, who sat to the year 300, in which the centuriators and Calvin profess that truly the primacy is asserted, and these popes were saints and true pontiffs, but they claim their epistles were contrived or recent and falsely ascribed to these popes. Right? So they say, oh yeah, those early bishops of Rome, they were saints and they were martyrs and what have you, and these letters certainly assert the primacy, but they're false, so we don't believe them. That's what they say. So, like Clement, the epistle Clement to the Corinthians is one of these ones that they're saying is false, even though all historians today, even Protestant ones, admit that it's real.
Well,
so, I mean, that's one of them.
Well,
so
when I was editing the Humility of Heart book for Father Bergamo, or Padre Bergamo, he referred to that work. And he referred to Saint Pope Gregory the Great referring to that work. And in one of his writings, I can't remember which one, he did so many meditations. Like today, we're supposed to recognize today is in the old calendar, today is the feast day of Job, or the commemoration day of Job, of St. Job from the Old Testament. And the great Pope St. Gregory the Great actually wrote an entire series of commentaries or meditations, I'm sure you've read them, Ryan, on the book of Job. And somewhere in those writings, I saw this particular work that he is referencing here. So Gregory is a lot closer to it than Luther was. What does Luther or Calvin know that Gregory didn't know?
Right. Well, yeah, there's a good question. So, but then nevertheless, their claim still is that at some point these were fabricated, right? So then the second class embraces the epistles of those popes who sat from the year 600 even to our times, in which our adversaries confess that truly the primacy was asserted, and they were the authors of these documents to which they're entitled, but these pontiffs were not worthy in regard to faith. They were pseudo-popes, not true popes. Namely, that they say that from about the year 600 or so. They don't agree all popes are antichrist, and so therefore it doesn't matter what they said, right? And that's the argument. So then there's this third class of popes that he's using, and this is where he's going to concentrate the argument. Those in which the primacy is openly asserted, those who wrote epistles in which the primacy is openly asserted, in which it is certain these were holy popes and true popes, and that they flourished from the year 300 to 600, namely Julius I, Damasus, Siricius, Innocent I, Pope Zosimus, Pope Leo the Great, Pope Gelasius, Pope Anastasius II, and so on and so forth, all the way to Gregory the Great. Therefore, the testimonies of the first and second class we will not devote attention to, but it will be enough to mark the citations in parentheses and respond to the objections of the heretics, whenever they affirm in those epistles that our opinion is clearly asserted. The quotes will only be conveyed in the testimonies of the third class, right? So he's not going to take the time really for the first or the second. He's going to focus on this class of popes,
okay,
from 300 to 600, who the Protestants do not deny wrote these epistles, who they do not deny are saints and holy popes, but also assert the primacy.
And so he goes to the list that you just went through, Clement and Ecletus.
Right. So this is the first class, and he's just marking which epistles they are in parentheses, and then he says, to these testimonies the heretics make no response except to say that they are recent and not genuine. But although I would not deny that some errors have crept into them, nor would I dare to affirm that they are indisputable, still, I certainly have no doubt whatsoever that they are very ancient. Thus the centuriators lie when they say that no worthy author before the times of Charlemagne cited these epistles. For Isidore, that is St. Isidore, Doctor of the Church,
right,
who is 200 years older than Charlemagne, says that by the Council of 80 bishops he gathered the canons of the epistles of Clement and Ecletus and Aristus and the rest of the Roman pontiffs. Likewise, the Council of Ascens, Canon 6, cites the letter of Clement just as they exist now, and they are also cited by a council celebrated in the time of Leo I, that is 350 years before the empire of Charlemagne.
Wow.
Lastly, Rufinus, who preceded Charlemagne by 400 years, in a preface to the Recognitions of Clement, which he translated from Greek, recalls also the epistles of Clement to James, and says that he translated them out of Greek himself. Further, the version is truly of Rufinus, and as the Gennadius Scholasticus witnesses, right, so later scholar. So, and Rufinus is, this is all pretty early, right? This is all 4th century he's talking about, that these things are happened. So they're not, fabricated in, like the donation of Constantine, which clearly couldn't have been earlier than about the 700s, I think. And it became one of those documents that candidates, because it was so clear, hey, well, why skip all the more complicated and difficult arguments? Let's just talk about this one. And that's what they did. So when it was shown to be false, then you kind of have egg on your face because they've been arguing with it for so long as a handy explanation of problems. And then, sure enough, it's false. So it was taken as, well, therefore the whole basis of the thing is false, which is not true. It's just rather, a lot of men were deceived by a false document.
Right.
And things like that happen at different times where they'll be writing as something, and who knows what the purpose is, whether somebody's maliciously doing it, whether there's, did the Pope command it? Did somebody insert this in there? Was this a draft of what somebody said happened, and then it got mixed up and thought to be a real decree or something like that? Who knows, honestly. But like many other things, too, it doesn't deny the other reasons that are brought. It's just simply that one document just became handy, right? So that's why you see that's what kicks off all the text criticism. It says things like that. So he says in the first class, these are very ancient. In the second class, that is the popes from 600 onwards, you have Adrian I, Nicholas I, Leo IX, Pascal I, Innocent III, etc. And all of these avowedly and in earnest teach that the Roman Pontiff is over the whole church.
Right.
Our adversaries respond to these by saying that all these popes were antichrists. Now, we will refute this in a later question, namely it's going to be in Book 3. I also have the book as a standalone book, if anyone's interested in that, slightly redacted, but which covers all the matter of that question.
Okay.
So meanwhile, actually you have it too in their
I do.
Founder's Story.
I do have it in the Founder's Story.
Meanwhile, we say this alone, if these pontiffs were antichrist, the whole church would have perished by nearly 1,000 years. It is certain from the histories that the universal church adhered to these popes and followed their teaching. But if the church perished, then Christ lied when he said in Matthew 16 that the gates of hell were not going to prevail against the church. But on this we have said enough in the question on the church, which actually hasn't been published yet. So let us come to the third class, and we advance the 12 best and holiest popes. So now he's going to deal with quotes, right, which we were running out of time, I'm sure, so we'll just deal with a few of these. So the first is St. Julius I, who in his epistle to the Oriental bishops speaks thus. Why are you ignorant of the fact that it is customary that first it should be written to us, that is the Roman See,
Okay.
that what is just can be defined from here? For which reason, if a crime of this kind had been conceived against a bishop, that is, namely St. Athanasius, it ought to be referred to our church. What we received from blessed Peter the Apostle, I show to you, and I should not have written this, as deeming that these things were manifest to everyone, had not these, that is, the bishop's proceedings so disturbed us. Okay, so Bellarmine then, does his commentary on it. In these words, St. Julius affirms that the duty of judging the cases of bishops pertains to him, even in the East, although they are primary patriarchs, for he treats in the case of St. Ignatius, the patriarch of, Athanasius, the patriarch of Alexandria. In his writing he received from St. Peter, which is known to everyone. What response, I ask, can be made? The author is a saint and very ancient, the epistle certain, and the whole written down by St. Athanasius, and at length his words are clear and eloquent, namely because this epistle is extant in St. Athanasius' Apology.
Oh, okay. So they actually have a copy of that
The
one.
second one, so you can find that on New Advent, I think, actually.
Okay.
The second is St. Damasus, who in a letter to all the Eastern bishops, which Theodoret relates, says, because your charity disturbed the reverence due to the Apostolic See, you most beloved sons excel, as many of you as there are. So Bellarmine says there he recognized the due reverence and calls all the bishops sons. Likewise in Epistle 4 to the bishops of Numidia, it's in North Africa, for those who are kind of weak in geography. Do not cease to bring all those things which are in some doubt to us, just as to the head, as has always been the custom. Okay. So he goes on for a few more, and I'll go to this next one. The fifth, a few more down. The fifth is St. Innocent I. In his epistle to the bishops of Macedonia, turn to the Apostolic See, the relation to which, just as to the head of the church, they did run, being sent when injury was done, etc. Likewise, in an epistle to the Council of Miletus, which is among the epistles to St. Augustine, he says, diligently and agreeably consult the apostolic honor, to the honor of that which is apart from those which are on the outside. Care remains of all the churches. They followed the ancient form of the rule which is always kept throughout the world. Likewise, in an epistle to the Council of Carthage, which is 91, he says, the Roman See is the font and head of all churches, emphasis in the original.
I see
To
that.
this, The centurions make no response, except that Innocent arrogates too much for himself. But for which reason they contumaciously call him Nocentius, right? And so there's a play on words, because the centurions wrote in Latin as well. And so Innocentius, obviously, we get in English, should be clear. So Nocentius in Latin means the guilty one, as opposed to innocent. But if that is so, why do the fathers not condemn this error of Innocent? What does St. Augustine say about these two letters of Innocent? Quote, he wrote on all things to us in the same manner in which it was lawful and also fitting for a bishop of the Apostolic See. Why does Augustine appeal to the blessed memory of Innocent in the same place? So it's a real clear argument, of course, and these epistles are contained in the writings of other fathers. And so it's not as if something you could just say was false. And these guys clearly show that they are the head. They expect to be understood as the head. And then, they expect to be obeyed. And the fathers reverence this fact. So therefore, again, what response could be made, Bellarmine's basically saying.
That's about all the time we have for this segment. Let me ask you a quick question in the few seconds that we have left. Are there any responses to, does Calvin and Lyricus, do they make any response to this body of evidence that is put to the task here to disprove the heretical claims?
Well, Calvin was dead when Bellarmine had written this treatise, but some of these arguments, a lot of times he'll cite an argument against Calvin, then he'll cite Calvin's reply to the argument because he's taken the argument from somebody else. And Calvin has seen this argument before, or sometimes Calvin's anticipated the argument, made a response, and then Bellarmine refutes the response. Right? So any response Calvin would have made to anything, Bellarmine had at his hands when he wrote this. So at least in this work, we would see it.
Okay. We'll be right back with our final segment of this